The project that I've been working on as part of this year's Humanities Center Viral Cultural theme is titled, Do You Remember the Days of Slavery? The Neo-Slave Narrative in Contemporary Caribbean Cultural Production. It examines the formal, aesthetic, political, and social resonances of the post-colonial neo-slave narrative genre by focusing on a case study of Caribbean texts. Neo-slave narratives are currently understood as, quote, contemporary novels that assume the form, adopt the conventions, and take on the first-person voice of the antebellum slave narrative, end quote. These contemporary fictional works, which take slavery as their subject matter and usually feature enslaved protagonists, are often characterized by explicit engagements with the material history of the enslavement of human beings. Things such as detailing the daily experiences and accounts of victimizations and rebellions, meditations on the concepts of freedom and enslavement, notions of voice, or articulating notions of voice linked to identity, and these are just a few of the most prevalent conventions that you usually see in neo-slave narratives. And while it is certainly true that the vast majority of neo-slave narratives, like the historical narratives, have been produced in the United States, a significant number have been written in a variety of locations across the globe. Neo-slave narratives have been written and produced in the Caribbean, such as Maurice Conde's I Tituba, Orlando Patterson's The Children of Sisyphus, Christina Garcia's Monkey Hunting, Dion Brand's At the Full and Change of the Moon, in South Africa, such as Yvette Christian's Unconfessed, Manu Herbstein's Ama, A Story of the African Slave Trade. In Nigeria, there's Shaihu Umar, which was written by the first federal prime minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, as well as Bushi Emacheda's novel Slave Girl. And then I've also added, I found out recently, about two more texts from South Asia that talk about slavery and indentureship in India, specifically those two novels. And yet, despite the knowledge of the globality of the institutions of enslavement, the overwhelming majority of scholarship on neo-slave narrative genre focuses on texts produced in the United States. Indeed, the definition of the genre seems itself grounded in the U.S. context of enslavement and its use of the term antebellum, which refers right to the Civil War. The earliest definition of the term, which is below this by Bernard Bell, is, quote, residually oral modern narratives of escape from bondage to freedom, right? This also reinforces the U.S. context in its focus on defining neo-slave narratives as fictional texts about escape and about the movement from bondage to freedom. So now acknowledging that there might be other movements in the neo-slave narratives. And while important work has been done in terms of highlighting the ways in which some neo-slave narratives aim to challenge structural racisms in the United States, the genre's relationships to issues of colonialism and neocolonialism have not been as extensively explored. Indeed, although there may be structural and metaphorical similarities between the positioning of African Americans within US society and the power relationships between colonizer and colonized, both experiences are not interchangeable or exact equivalencies. The majority of post-bellum conversations about African American culture in the United States have been about integration, so focused on facilitating and acknowledging the presence of blackness within the United States cultural imaginary and history, while conversations in the formerly colonized nations are primarily ones of disintegration in the wake of national independence movements and assertions of unique post-colonial ideologies. As many scholars have pointed out, the institution of slavery in the Caribbean was distinct from that in the United States. To name just a few of the historical distinctions, in addition to the context of colonialism, many more of the enslaved in the Caribbean were brought directly from Africa. There was greater linguistic and cultural diversity across the various islands, and much greater prevalence of absentee ownership, meaning that the plantations were actually owned by, their owners actually lived in England or France or the Netherlands, somewhere else, but not in the actual Caribbean. There are also distinctions in the contemporary engagements with the history of colonial slavery. So for example, the day-to-day physical presence of the material history of slavery is greater in the Caribbean. Just to give you a couple of examples of that, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, she's a Cuban visual artist, talks about growing up in what used to be slave barracoons. Right, the experience of actually growing up in a slave house. There are numerous middle-class residential housing schemes that are built on and named after sugar plantations. And one can also still see groups of men and women cutting canes with machetes in the Caribbean. There's also, right, obviously, post-colonial geopolitics, as well as, most importantly, the lack of an explicit slave narrative tradition. There is a retrospective one, which if you're curious about, you can go and buy my book, which discusses that. These distinctions are emblematic of the diversity of the institutions of enslavement. As Paul Gilroy has argued in The Black Atlantic, the international story of slavery cannot be understood as primarily national narratives. African Atlantic slavery, like contemporary slavery, was a global institution. Focusing on slavery as a singular national narrative invested in inserting its inclusion within and problematizing larger international dialogues of US literary and social historical history makes it easier to overlook the global aspects of the institution of enslavement. My aim here is not to critique US narratives for privileging the US context, but to acknowledge the significant distinctions that experiences of colonialism has had on social, political, and aesthetic developments in post-colonial nations, as well as to suggest that this distinction is worth analyzing because it helps us to develop a better understanding of the genre. So at the heart of the study are two broad questions that bear on the theme of viral culture. First, how and why do genres travel across the globe? And then second, how and why do they travel amongst different media? Initially, I was convinced that virality was an apt metaphor for the circulation of neo-slave narratives, primarily because it echoed the 18th and 19th century circulations of historical slave narratives through public and private print networks, some of which you saw in Ryan Cordell's work on the circulation of 19th century print culture. But the wide and pervasive circulation of the genre offered a useful image for communicating the multiplicity of the genre. And yet, as the seminar went on, I began to question whether virality was indeed a useful metaphor for this project. Contemporary understandings of virality, or more specifically, Virality 2.0, and this name comes from Robert Payne's essay of the same name, like Web 2.0, is primarily about users sharing information. Something goes viral because many people circulate it. One of the questions that kept coming up in our fellowship meetings was when something goes viral, or at what number can something be considered or defined as having gone viral. The answer, of course, is it depends on the context, but it's primarily a numbers game, a popularity contest. When significant numbers, this is always a sliding scale, right? Say it has gone viral, it has gone viral. As connected to my project, it seems exceedingly problematic to say that the progressive circulation and sharing of things like the ICANN Has Cheeseburger website, whose sole objective was to collect the greatest numbers of hits, was useful in any way for understanding the circulation of neo-slave narratives. So while on the one hand, some aspects of the circulation of the neo-slave narrative as a genre could be traced to the popularity of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, that came out in 1987, the fact that since 2007, no less than 5 Caribbean writers have published neo-slave narrative novels. Unburnable by Maria Helena John, 2007, The Book of the Night Women by Marlon James, Long Song, Andrew Levy, The Island Beneath the Sea, Isabel Allende, and Evelyn Trio's The Infamous Rosalie, which came out in 2012. Calls out to be read as more than mere market coincidence or popularity. The vast linguistic and stylistic differentiation within even this very short list of texts, texts in English, Spanish, and French, a popular ethnic urban love story, a postmodern colonial Gothic. There are 2 historical romances in that list, one embracing magical realism, the other embracing social realism, suggests that the circulation of the neo-slave narrative genre needs to be understood in ways beyond progressive popularity or adaptation. Moreover, this diversity seems to suggest that maybe the Caribbean texts were not imitating or adapting Morrison, but rather transforming the genre. My unease with the viral 2.0 metaphor was compounded when I thought about what made the Caribbean narratives distinctive. One of the key distinctions was a lack of an explicit and formal slave narrative tradition. Because such a tradition formally and explicitly exists in the US, right, and the genre was discussed as a distinct genre even in the mid-19th century, so it's pretty much been its own genre for a while. Most, if not all, US slave narratives, or neo-slave narratives, are forced to engage with that tradition. Consider the furors around, Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, right? Edward Jones's Known World, Kara Walker's work, Django Unchained, probably 12 Years a Slave, right? This idea that there is a proper way to narrate the story of enslavement. and that these examples are all not proper. The absence of such a tradition might have made it more possible for contemporary Caribbean artists to feel free to revise and reframe or creolize the neo-slave narrative. Indeed, many more works by Caribbean artists seem invested in creating alternative versions of the neo-slave narratives. So what do some of these alternative versions look like? I talked earlier about the distinction that the experience of colonialism makes. Two examples are to be found in Carpentier's The Kingdom of This World and Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. Kingdom of This World was published in 1949, Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea is 1966. So they're both written during the colonial and immediate post-colonial eras, which comes to a formal end in the Caribbean, specifically in Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962, not counting Haiti, of course. While both texts are concerned with highlighting the social impacts of enslavement, they also map the very different registers of slavery and political discourse outside of the US context. More specifically, both Sargasso Sea and Kingdom challenge notions of Enlightenment subjectivity by explicitly rewriting European canonical texts and foundational ideologies. Kingdom rewrites mid-century notions of postmodernism and existentialism, and Sargasso rewrites Bronte's Jane Eyre, or we can say it rewrites Bronte's Jane Eyre. One of the things it does is rewrite Bronte's Jane Eyre, and Victorian assumptions about colonial identities. Moreover, both novels situate themselves in explicit opposition to European cultural traditions. Carpentier through an employment of magical realism, Rhys through her articulation of what we might call feminist Creole postmodernism. And there are obviously other ways in which they do these things as well. Written during the circulation of conversations about Pan-Caribbean identities via organizations such as the West Indies Federation, the New World and Caribbean artist movements, both novels construct modern romantic heroes and heroines that challenge and triumph over colonizing ideologies and assert new proto- and post-colonial ideologies that embrace romantic notions of freedom and Creole or hybrid, authentically Caribbean identities. In more contemporary texts, given the prevailing assumption of the lack of an authentic, self-written Caribbean slave narratives, one might assume that these texts might also aim to provide authentic or realistic voices on behalf of those who were previously marginalized. And while certainly some Caribbean texts, such as Fred Daguzar's Feeding the Ghosts and Evelyn Trio's Rosalie l'Enfant, Rosalie the Infamous, do draw heavily upon historical realism and romanticism, there are those that make other surprising aesthetic choices. For example, in terms of representations of Europe, many post-colonial neo-slave narratives, such as the Book of the Night Women or the Long Song, Europe is relegated to the background, or it's textually absent, occasionally articulated as a ghostly presence haunting both the text and the characters throughout. Though like the earlier texts, the later novels illuminate the horrors of colonial slavery, they're also more frequently focused on the entangled power relationships inherent to the Caribbean slave system and highlight the paradoxes within 18th and 19th century colonial societies. Rather than articulate progressive romantic movements toward authentic or incipient freedoms, the texts also communicate more complex notions of freedom as well as voice. Indeed, although most of the post-colonial texts appropriate the often first-person narration associated with the historical slave narratives, the Caribbean texts also often incorporate a variety of different narrative formats and techniques, including multiple and unreliable narrators, which we see in Wide Sargasso Sea, Aititiba, and the Long Song, as just a couple of examples. Moreover, many of these neo-slave narratives are not always grounded in psychological or social realism, or the singular autobiographical format often associated with the genre. Again, I'm not saying that US narratives don't do this, I'm saying that the Caribbean narratives do these in a different kind of way. So for example, Nalo Hopkinson's novel The Salt Roads from 2004 draws on the genre of speculative, fantasy, and science fiction. Other Caribbean neo-slave narratives also draw upon the unusual formats of the folk tale and the young adult novel. And Novazy Phillips' novel, Harriet's Daughter, is a young adult novel that takes up the story of slavery. And while the postcolonial narratives are also invested in providing descriptions of the specificity and distinction of slavery in the Caribbean, they also seem to be asking new and different questions about the history of slavery and its contemporary resonances. In particular, many of the texts seem intent on complicating the notion of social death, frequently associated with understandings of racial bondage that predominantly portray the world and psychology of the enslaved person as one solely of lack, negation, and powerlessness. And think about the fact that no one seems to be discussing a scene in 12 Years a Slave where Patsy is shown in that beautiful field, right, making dolls. The focus seems to obsessively, right, be on her sexual, physical, and mental torture. In Slavery and Social Death, sociologist Orlando Patterson argued that in order to facilitate and normalize the enslavement of Africans, a whole host of ideologies and discourses were consciously and unconsciously manipulated, developed and deployed to represent Africans as subhuman and outside of normal family and social relations, and therefore natural slaves. More recent scholarship, such as that by historians Vincent Brown and Jenny Shaw, has asserted that scholars have too eagerly taken up Patterson's notion of social death and used it to rigidly define and regulate representations of enslaved human beings. Similar to the work of historians of Caribbean slavery, then, the fictional narratives aim to complicate notions about the worlds of enslaved African human beings by revealing the complexly nuanced ways in which they reconstituted and created new societies and nations in the Caribbean. One of the key conventions in the neo-slave narrative, beyond their engagement with colonialism and history, is its connection to the present. Several scholars have illuminated the ways in which the genre was influenced by and had an impact on the social movements of civil and post-civil rights movements. Similar connections between the past and the present are apparent in Caribbean neo-slave narratives. And again, as with the other conventions of the genre, the distinction of the Caribbean post-colonial context alters that genre. In particular, many recent Caribbean neo-slave narratives are invested in highlighting the similarities and relationships between contemporary power imbalances in the Caribbean with those in the past. So for example, Levy's novel The Long Song records the rescue of only the protagonist from the slavery-like experiences of the apprenticeship period. Although it might have been wishful thinking to expect July's son, July's the protagonist, the main character, to save all of the apprentices, it is striking that no mention is made of the other apprentices who remain in semi-bondage, nor is any attention paid to detailing the community with whom July had been living. In addition to revealing mutations in definitions of family from the wider non-community family apparent during enslavement and apprenticeship into the tighter kinship circle of July's son and his family in the post-emancipation era, the novel also seems to critique this elevation of the personal over the communal. In offering this critique of the privileging of the personal, Levy's novel resonates with the, quote, Helen handbasket, communalism under colonialism was better, rhetoric of the public comment section of most, if not all, contemporary Caribbean newspapers. So there are always these letters that say, you know, life was much better under colonialism and everyone took care of each other, that kind of thing. And so that seems to be similar to the critique that Levy is making here, or at least speaks to it. I've lost my place now. As well as the rise in gated communities and personal security companies intended to facilitate the increasing separation of classes in the contemporary Caribbean. So the argument is that, right, this focus on individual over the community, right, is making the situation in which people feel comfortable living in these gated communities, basically. In recording the complexities of perspectives during the colonial emancipation periods, Levy's novel highlights the ways in which these relationships of enslavement continue to structure post-colonial Caribbean societies. Indeed, the most recent proliferation of neo-slave narrative novels coincides with recent calls for reparations for slavery in the Caribbean. And on Monday, so this past Monday, 15 Caribbean nations revealed their 10-point plan during the meeting of CARICOM, which is basically European, a version of the European Economic Union. Anyways, so they've released a 10-point plan. And in a departure from the fiery recriminations and calls for Europe to pay recompense to the descendants of slaves of the early decolonization era, as exemplified by Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, which was written in 1944. The current rhetoric of reparations, which interestingly was written by another Caribbean historian of slavery, Sir Hilary Beckles of Barbados, whose, fun fact, ancestors were owned by Benedict Cumberbatch's ancestors. Supposedly this is why he took the part in 12 Years a Slave. But anyway, so the current rhetoric is being framed not as punishments for the formerly colonizing nations, so they are not requesting billions of dollars from the European former colonizers, despite whatever the Daily Mail may say, but as the socialist humanist acknowledgement of the real and continuing structural effects of the historical institution. The diversity of the manifestations and developments in the neo-slave narrative in the Caribbean confirms that Caribbean texts do not just imitate or adapt Morrison's or other American neo-slave narratives, but rather shift or alter the genre and the content to convey different themes, different questions, and different concerns. Generic shifts are basically understood as occurring when the genre in question changes shape and pushes past its limits through encounters with new contents and forms. And once again, we are back to the figure of the virus. The generic shifts or alterations in neo-slave narrative seem to echo, right, the mutation and alteration of viruses. And actually, Lana, can you pass out?
She did it.
Oh, she did. Oh, cool. Okay. Let me see. However, rather than mere sharing, this version of virality has more in common with the term's initial definition in epidemiology as an entity spread by contact and which could change its form depending on the host. Encouraged by readings shared by my more scientifically trained colleagues in the fellowship group, so readings about R0 and scientific methods and development of laboratories, it began to seem as though this initial understanding of virality, so virality 1.0, if you will, could operate as a useful, meaningful chronotope. Chronotope is basically defined as a representative figure meant to articulate the materiality and fusion of both time and space. So it's allowing me to talk about the historical narratives without it degenerating into a teleological kind of argument, but also capturing the more fluid, rhizomatic, rather than progressive understanding of the genre circulation across the globe. Drawing on the initial definition of virality also highlighted the process of alteration and mutation necessitated by the host population. Moreover, this version of virality, unlike the sharing version, could also accommodate the genre's engagement with contemporary social political action. So just as in the 18th and 19th century, when slavery was characterized as an insidious and ravenous disease that must be eradicated through social action, facilitated after reading slave narratives, the historical slave narratives, contemporary discourse about modern slavery also relies upon the rhetoric of disease. Historian Kevin Bales, founder of Free the Slaves, author of Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy, and a leading force behind the recently released Global Index of Modern Slavery, which counted 29 million enslaved individuals globally today, which is more than in the past. Remember, 2 to 6 million slaves were imported from Africa, but this was over 200 years of the slave trade. Has said that, quote, the accurate labeling and tracking of the disease of slavery is the first step in beating it. He continues, it's a lot like epidemiology, he said, and we have to get in there and vaccinate, but first we have to figure out where the disease is and what are the risk factors. So in the same way that you do with an epidemic, it's not always in the same place. There are different supporting factors. In offering commentary on the connections between historical and modern versions of enslavement, the Caribbean narratives not only echo its historical antecedents, but also reveal nuanced understandings of the interconnectedness of power and discourse, suggesting the necessity for new ways to combat modern global enslavement. This version of virality as a chronotope, which foregrounds more complicated perspectives about the institution of enslavement and its continuing effects, is also helpful for understanding how and why contemporary visual artists, musicians, and architects also appropriate the genre, translating it into non-textually based media, as in films such as Dance Hall Queen and Get a Life, as well as visual art by Annalee Davis, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, Ebony Patterson, and Jocelyn Gardner. And what these works tend to have in common is that they comment on the relationship between racial bondage, global capitalism, and wage slavery. These para and extra literary texts frequently use the neo-slave narrative forms, themes, and aesthetics to highlight the pervasiveness of the continuing impacts of enslavement. And in so doing, I want to argue in the larger project, underscore the viral malleability of the genre, as well as the possibility of jumping to dissimilar media. And just as an example, this is Annalee Davis's video piece, Identities Withheld by Choice. She also has a related series called Migrant Discourse. It records interviews with several Caribbean migrant workers. The video offers direct commentary on the passage of on the passage in 2001 of Article 45 of the revised Treaty of Chagarumas, which was signed by CARICOM, which was intended to implement free movement of Caribbean nationals between the 14-member CARICOM islands. But it's never been put into practice, never been, so you still need papers. It's still incredibly difficult. And if you don't have papers, obviously, it's incredibly difficult. So the testimonies of the migrants who move from island to island seeking work without official papers and consequently live and must be filmed in disguise and shadow offers an eerie echo of the 18th and 19th century testimonies of enslaved individuals. Like their economic forebears, they reveal the entrenched nature of forced labor that effectively disenfranchised significant numbers of contemporary Caribbean peoples, whose stories can only be told obliquely. Focusing on global permutations of the neo-slave narrative through a case study of Caribbean texts enables us to better appreciate the viral rhizomatic permutations of the genre and its circulation. Additionally, it highlights the significance of change and mutation to considerations of genre. Privileging and confining the prior understandings of the neo-slave narrative has become unuseful and very unhelpful because of its connections to static histories of US exceptionalism. To constrict the rhetorical range and understanding of fictional narratives of enslavement facilitates overlooking contemporary permutations of enslavement. And as terrible as it sounds, we must acknowledge that there are many stories of enslavement. And yet, these stories, while certainly revealing the sheer horror of the experiences of enslavement, also speak powerfully to the creative and generative power of resilience and cultural transcendence across the African diaspora. Thank you.